Welcome. Thank you all so much for attending tonight's talk. My name is Anastasia. I'm the director at Richard Gray Gallery, and we're so honored to have Theaster's beautiful exhibition here in the space, and to have the opportunity tonight to hear more from the artist, along with Michelle Grabner and Zachary Cahill. I'm just going to briefly introduce tonight's speakers, and if we have time, maybe after the talk, we can have a couple more questions about the issues that you bring up, and a little bit of time for you to continue viewing the work in light of their words. So I'm not going to read the bios because then I could take up the whole hour, but just to briefly introduce, Michelle Grabner is an artist, curator, and writer. She recently reviewed this exhibition in Art Forum, and I encourage you all to read that if you haven't. If anybody here doesn't know Michelle, a friend aptly recently described her as the Midwest's very own version of Hans Ulrich Obrist. And I think she has one up on HUO because she's also an accomplished visual artist. Michelle is now based in Wisconsin, where she continues her projects, The Poor Farm and The Suburban, but we can still count her as a Chicagoan because she's on faculty at SAIC. Zachary Cahill is a multidisciplinary artist, critic, curator, and teacher, and he serves as Director of Fellowships and Programs at Gray Center for Arts and Inquiry at University of Chicago. And I'll borrow Dieter Rollstrada's words of describing Zachary's artistic practice. Quote, "Someone out there was making shamelessly political art, as opposed to merely making art politically." And as I said, you can read bios and look online for much, much more, but those words resonate. Zachary is also going to be the author of our upcoming exhibition catalog on this exhibition, and we're really excited to be producing that, and you can pre-order. There's a sign-up sheet in the front for you to pre-order. And Zachary is also the founding director of Portable Gray, which is an incredible new journal that he's brought copies to share with you all. That's also up front. And that brings me to Theaster Gates, who clearly by this turnout needs no introduction.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, this is incredible. We've never had a turnout like this for an event. And again, I'm not going to read his bio, but in installing this exhibition, something Theaster said is that he's been creating shows and exhibitions throughout the world, in Basel, and Paris, and London, and that this show was an opportunity to bring home to Chicago jewels from these new bodies of work. And so there's lots to talk about here. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you.
This show, something that struck me about the exhibition, and one of the things that I talked to you about is I was kind of left speechless in some of the work, in so much as that, I was talking to a friend of ours, and I said, "Have you seen the show? It's quite intense." And they looked at me, and they said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, it's quite intense." And I was referring to, of course, the large sculpture in the center of the room, which was something I think when I came to see the show, there was this moment of should I go up on it or not, or, and it really stopped me in my tracks. I didn't feel comfortable, and I wonder. I could say what kind of connotations it evoked for me, but I'd be more interested in hearing from you, Theaster, this thing that you're talking about. That maybe people are supposed to figure it out, but I wonder if you could give us some clues as to what's happening in this work for you.
Yeah, so, in some ways, the show is code, let's say. So I just taught this class. The class was called Big Art, Little Art. And it feels like the class called Big Art, Little Art, I have a show called Every Square Needs a Circle. And it felt like there was something flat-footed and really primary, that I feel like if we just keep this simple, all the simple stuff will reveal all the complicated stuff. You know what I mean? And so this building is so kind of already beautiful that I felt like I wanted to interrupt its natural beauty with my own grid, my own set of systems. And I needed like a platform for staging a world. And let's say that I'm staging the Chicago grid, or I'm staging the capacity to see at different levels. And so these two works on either side are arranged so that you're at viewing height when you're standing to look at the slave, ex-slave piece. But if you're looking at, a Southside school, you're looking down at it, and those kind of moves. And so I needed a platform, and I think in some ways, maybe talking about the platform or the grid is the easiest way to suggest that the central piece becomes the city, or it becomes a battleground, or a theater set, or a landmine, or land mass, and that kind of architectural move becomes an unquestionable basis for how I imagine my experience in Chicago, right? So that most of the time when I'm talking to people candidly about what the city for me has become a contract with land, And so I wanted to bring some of that, the truth of that contract, or the truth of my basis in the city, which is land ownership in a way. It's like I have memories of going to high school and memories of going to elementary school, but my today present is that I have contracts with the city over the ownership of land, and that land requires that I do things. And so I feel like in some ways this theater set, or this elevation platform in its precision, is my first square, is the kind of primary square. And it's from this square that things either work or don't work, are seen or not seen, are available to you or not. And the square never tells you whether or not you can go up on it or not, whether or not you have access to the thing. I wanted to make a big square.
You've talked a lot about viewing works that are around the piece. Could you talk a little bit about the pieces that are actually in the square itself?
Yeah, so there's basically the truth of my learning things by hand, the truth of my engagement with others to make things that are beyond my personal capacity to lift or move or do, and then the value that I have for nature, and those things, how those things kind of tie together. And then, the athletic shaman, with this Wilson headband, these moments where totem and mask and sweat, when those things start doing things ritually that sometimes you don't have a name for, or you don't know why. I don't know why I feel so called, why those things call out to me so much. But in a way, it was like, it feels like a kind of the raw biography. Like, it's like a self-portrait. And that those moments encode, this beautiful colored stone that, like, with work is probably more sexy than any painting anybody could make. And that its making, or its life as it is the byproduct of eruption and violence and volcano and land masses smashing together and meeting with basalt and meeting with marble and being found only in one or two places in the world, right? And that it's a ready-made. It's a ready-made, but in fact, it is not the earth's ready-made. The earth had to do a whole lot to get that thing ready. And I feel like, anyway, when I'm contemplating things, that's how my brain works. So I just thought, well, instead of making work that's about explaining something, I'm just gonna give people access to the things that make me think. And so in this way, the show isn't about demonstrating prolificness or how well I can make a thing. It's more about like, oh, these things trained me. These streets trained me. I understand balance. I understand composition. And it's like my jam, like why those things live where they live, why there's no floor in the grid, why that grid is exposed. All those things are kind of revealing just my brain. And yeah.
I'm going to jump in a little bit. It's my observation, Theaster, that, again, it's a beautiful way of articulating what those elements are within that field, right? That field metaphor for a city.
Yeah.
But there's also a protective quality to that structure.
Yeah.
It also works as a large vitrine.
Yeah.
Right? And unlike the other work in the exhibition, which we will go at formally, start
Yeah, sure.
teasing it apart,
Yeah.
there are traces, marks, your touch in those works, your thinking, that's very different than the other works. And I just want to kind of pose a almost psychoanalytical containment or, how that work is protected within that field. At the
Yeah.
same time, that metaphor for the city, that place that you know, that place that you engage.
Yeah, well, I got to do this. I'm sorry, you guys. I didn't mean I wasn't going to do this. But the thing that I like about it, if it's about like or something I like about it, is that there are also these references to like, traditional Japanese architecture,
Yes.
where there's privacy in here, and there might be a series of rooms that have private things happening, but each of the rooms need to be serviced. And so you need a lane so that privacy and service are kind of coexisting, right? So this walk is not just about perspective, but it has something to do with the adjacency to service. The adjacency service has to things that it's not privy to the thing happening in the grid, but it's constantly, it's servicing the grid, And that, Chicago feels like that sometimes. So you can have a person who's been a CTA bus driver for 30 years servicing the city, but that CTA bus driver would have, doing a route their whole life up and down Pulaski, but would have no access, or by some strange construct, no access to the things that are happening past the places that he's traveling every day, she's traveling every day. And I think this booby, I mentioned the word booby trap, that this thing is often not allowing everyone to have access in the same way. But if I had a shoe that was 24 inches by 24 inches, I could have a different way of walking on this thing and never hurt myself. But if I go in with the shoes that I was born with, then the thing would seem like it was not made for my feet. Anyway, so there's that kind of stuff that's like, it feels, yeah. And then your question about containment, containment works differently for me. Like, if we were talking about perimeter or parameters or a finiteness, you know, that then I could say, oh, I need things to square up sometimes so that I could mess with them, you know? So it's like, I like working at the University of Chicago because they say no a lot, you know, and it's a kind of strange, it's a strange thing. But I kind of need the bump against a rule. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Kind of to follow on the containment question, and so much of the work to me has like a real gut punch quality to it. And one piece is definitely the Madonna and child in a cage. And I know you didn't necessarily.
That's containment.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about that. I mean, talking earlier, we had kind of mentioned, or at least for me, it just resonated really strongly with what's happening on our southern borders with families in cages. And that may not have been your intent, but I wonder, talk about the choice to put the Madonna and child in a
Yeah,
in a
well, I
cage.
mean, I think it also gets to Michelle's question of kind of formalism. If we assume that I had some formalist intent, then it seems like there's a few squares in the room, and that the big square, like I said, it ain't necessarily about a thing withheld or a thing locked in. It for me, it kind of is a defined space, and inside of it, inside those grids, it feels infinite for me. You know, like being able to see down through the floor, being able to see up through the grid, the amount of time it took to put all the parts together to make it strong. It feels like that time is generous inside the thing. But with the Madonna, it was different. You know, it was like the Madonna herself, and that cast is from my project in Basel, where I took a Madonna, a keychain that was given to me by a friend, and then we blew it up into a foam cast, and then we cast it. And the little keychain, you know, from being in my bag or my duffel or someone else's duffel before me, the Christ arm had broken off, and then maybe the Madonna hand had broken off. And it was a little insignificant keychain that was kind of like every day blessing the bag or blessing the person, making sure they had their keys, making sure that the car started, keeping you from accidents. A material connection to the divine as a keychain. But with the square, I was thinking about how there are moments where, let's say, a spiritual world or an invisible world is all around us. There are all these things that kind of keep us from having access to it. There are all these moments that I remember in my childhood where black preachers were always talking about somebody trying to touch Jesus's hem, you know? Like I don't even need to touch the dude. If I can just touch some part of the material, a thing that's just on his body, that connection, that a connection to a material thing connected to spiritual power will give me spiritual power, you know? And what happens when you can't even get to the hem? You can't identify a moment where the material world is offering you anything into the infinite. So, do I think about abuelita? Absolutely. Grandmothers being stopped at borders? Absolutely. The idea that children are being held unto death? Absolutely. That we're potentially not only assassinating genius in our young black boys and girls with this K2 and these synthetic drugs and the challenges of school, prison over school. All of those things are on my mind. But the show is just about circles and squares. And I'm just pulling things from the studio, and I don't have to think about those things for this show. I got an old rusty gate, and I got a cast.
Yeah, all right. Yes, you do think about these things, and it's much more than circles and squares, and it's the formal qualities that we're talking about. Let's circle around to the politics of form.
Yeah.
And I think the juxtaposition between the Black Madonna and the metaphor of the city, right, the square, the difference of interpretation that can happen within that same geometry, right, how spaces and bodies are organized very differently
Yeah.
from one piece to the other.
Yeah.
Where narrative is illicit and more explicit, let's say, in the Black Madonna, right, still possibly being open, there's a high degree of abstraction about how those bodies, those hands, those clay bodies work within that space. So I think it's a beautiful example how formal choices, the formal choices you're making, can open up a narrative to the point of being abstract, obligating we, the viewer, into a kind of deep interpretation in which there is no right answer. That grid can be the modernist grid of containment, right? Of exclusion, or it can be a suspension. And that's what's so beautiful about the open floor, that these bodies are suspended in a very different way than that Black Madonna.
Yeah.
So I think I just want to, and again, we can tease out how you use form, because I think we talked at one point, and you claim to be a formalist, as am I, but not in the formalist, poor, old school way, which is about taste, a decision about aesthetics. It really is about politics and order and hierarchy, and it's just a beautiful juxtaposition that Zach brings up.
Thank you. So, if you go back to the Madonna, she's on a plinth, and the plinth is on a plinth, and there's a cerulean granite that I got from the Walker Museum. That granite was their former plaza. And when I did a work in their garden, they had all this granite from the plaza, so I traded them a portion of my artist fee for the cost of transporting the granite to Chicago. The transport of the granite was $75,000, So I got a lot of granite in my backyard. And I put weight under her weight, And then from the granite, there's a piece of carpet that's from maybe the 3rd floor of Johnson Publishing. It's a little square cut. It's not hemmed at the edges the way we've been making them cute. It's a piece of the garment. It's a piece of Black DNA that people are saying is bankrupt. And I'm saying, well, if I could get that DNA inside my Madonna, then a portion of Johnson Publishing will always live in the world, and will always, as long as people are talking about the Madonna, they're always talking about Johnson Publishing. As long as I'm making these neons about Du Bois, then I'm trying to put Du Bois on our minds. And there's one part of the formalistic stuff that is like, how do I weave histories in, but not just history for history's sake, history when the world is trying to say that whatever Johnson Publishing was, it ain't good no more. That's some bullshit. And so there are moments where it's like it requires a kind of quiet weaving into the fabric of the sculptural work these other truths that's like, oh, that rug is hot. And it's like, and having a museum foundation followed by a Black foundation, followed by this kind of ethereal divine. When I'm thinking about formalisms, I'm not thinking about, let's say, the history of formalisms. I'm thinking about the importance of form, the importance of aggregating forms toward an end, right? Then around this room, if it is just code, then what I'm trying to do is just freak form, just finding ways that I could let my peers and my homies into those deep conversations we have at 2 in the morning that should have been recorded. When things get real open and real honest. And that on the surface, if you're saying that this thing packs a punch, Zach, other people walk out of here and it's like, ain't shit on the walls, ain't nothing in here. And so what's the difference between you saying it packs a punch and somebody saying, ain't nothing up in this mud? You got a piece of concrete and shit, I could do that. And that I'm always talking to that person. I'm always talking, I'm not talking to Rob's store or some shit. I'm always talking to the person that's like, fuck is that? That's the voice in my head. It's not like, oh, the juxtaposition.
That effect, for me particularly, was with this piece over here, the water fob, which if some of the other pieces are clearly coded and representational, that one struck me for kind of at once being blank, maybe to people who don't know, but for folks that spend time along the Chicago waterfront, it's very particular to the city. And I felt like that was, when you talk about a homecoming, and people have been talking about that show, that was a piece that really spoke to me as like, yeah, I see you, you're from Chicago, you know me. The piece was saying that to me. And just to wonder the choice to include that piece.
Well, I was going to move the speaker, but I was afraid that the speaker would topple on top of the fob. It would be I was limiting my exposure. The Joseph Bois piece in Kassel, Germany, 7,000 oaks. Is that right? By each oak, he would offer a stone next to the work, a kind of marker so that you'd have the tree of life. I don't know what was on his mind. He was planting trees. You'd have a tree that is living, and then you'd have this stone that is living, but is fixed. It's already a kind of fixed object. It's not the stone ain't growing. And sometimes the trees would fall in Kassel, and the stone would be there as a reminder that the tree had existed, indicating its path, demonstrating that something lived here. And I think in the contract with Kassel, the stone couldn't move even if the tree had to go away, let's say. The fobs are fobs are normally used as stanchions that keep people. They're another perimeter-making, border-making thing. But I wanted to use that kind of Chicago indicator next to my painting, next to the tar work, painting. And in a way, I almost want Paul to leave the marker in the same place for the next show. And like, could I say to the gallery, hey, for the next year, leave me up in this mug. And just lead that move, almost like when the land around Howard University was black. And there's only one black house left. And now all the white people on P Street, they now eat outside with champagne and quinoa. And they're eating outside on their front stoop. And they're replicating the forms of blackness. But it looks so civil compared to the last brother on the block who's eating chicken wings from down the street with his pit bull, giving his pit bull the bones. And it's like he's eating and he's playing his music loud because he's like, I am not fucking leaving P Street. And when you see him, when I walked past this brother on the street, he was like this, on his porch, he was long. He was like this. Yeah, all right. You know, and to both sides of him, the new restaurants were coming. This brother was laid out, I'm telling you. And you could just tell that he was the water fob. Like he was gonna, I don't know if it was his grandmama house. I don't know if he bought the house. But he was like, oh, no, this is how we used to do it. And down the street, they were having like there was an empty lot. It was so deep, man. It's D.C. It was an empty lot, and they were having a dance contest next to the church. And it was like all these really beautiful, hip white people were walking by, and they were like, why is the music so loud? God, it's always so loud. Sundays is a day of rest. It's like, oh, God. Oh. It's like, and then, you know, a couple people would be like, oh, it's so interesting, you know. You know, but the neighborhood ain't black no more. And Howard could have had that land. You know, and I keep talking about this. Howard could have had that land, but they were happy to be within the confines. Spelman could have had that land across the street. But the 80s was hard on us. The 80s was hard. The 90s were hard. Crack was hard. And so then you got to say to a judge, the circuit court judge of the state of Georgia, that your daughter is safe here. And so they needed them walls. They needed them walls in 89 in Atlanta. They imagined that the only solution was to do the same thing that the University of Chicago did. University of Chicago ain't the only ones that made walls around school. Hampton got walls. Tuskegee got walls. And then that becomes this other demarcation. When it's black on black, it gets real interesting. It wasn't even class. Spelman, you know, it was legacied class. It was generational survival of a certain way of living blackly. And that thing needed to be protected as much as the children of the Mayflower, right? And that protection then was like the Madonna, that there was all of this intelligence, deep spirituality, great social justice, one of the coldest science tech, like kind of doctoral studies programs in the country, and all of that stuff was confined to this space because something had happened that made me think my cousin on the other side of the wall is too dangerous. There was no mechanism for any of us to exert power from the cage or to allow the animals outside the cage to touch the him. Right? And that's where you mentioned the word affect when you started this part. When I say there's a little voice in my head that's like, nigga, what is that? I think that my formalism comes from this voice in my head. And because the primary judge of the work might be so different from Rob's store, right? Because the primary judge in my head is so different, it means that the outcomes of the work are different. Even if they share a material vocabulary or a sensibility, the thing that's happening in my head is totally different. Do I need the granite or the rug? Can't I just sell the edition of the Madonna? I got 3 of them. Can't you just sell the Madonna? Do I have to have the cage around the Madonna? Can you make the Madonna smaller? The granite is too heavy per square inch for my condo. And it's like, well, it's heavy. It's heavy. Ain't no change. Ain't no change. Ain't no change. You know? I like that.
Let's circle back just a little bit.
Thanks so much. Speaking of circles.
No, and it's, yes, speaking of circles, it was something you said about who the perceived audience is, that person who may not have the visual vocabulary, the experience that we have in the art world, right? Yeah. And that's interesting to me because and I don't want to dwell down on form, but let's talk about organization, composition, sure. Right? Yeah. Because there is a clarity, a stability, and a concreteness to everything in this exhibition. So yeah. You're talking about the Madonna, you're talking about the material signifiers. That is nearly totemic. It is vertical. You can read it, right? There is hierarchy to it. It has a containment to it. Yeah. So even though those things may have to be interpreted from the viewer to a certain degree, there still is a concern that you have to give some, again, I'm going to say stability, yeah. But a welcoming point. It's okay for you to have your interpretation. You have your interpretation here, yeah. Right? Yeah. But there is enough openness and abstraction to how you use material and how you organize those materials, those forms, that allow an openness of other possible interpretations. In some cases it's more direct, and this kind of circles back around. And so maybe that is a comment and not a question, but I would like to circle back around to sources, because within this exhibition, the three of us, just the two of us, can hit sources that you evoked, but also sources that you haven't evoked, and we can feel very secure on. So you evoked Agnes Martin. You just evoked Joseph Bois. We have, let's see, appropriate. We got to talk about the word, what appropriation is and its relationship to critique, but I cannot stop by going back to that generation of artists in the 80s in New York that was looking at commercial culture and signage. That piece and Ashley Bickerton, I cannot separate those two and what's happening there, although this is highly specific to Chicago. It is localized the way those New York artists were dealing with a kind of more global commercial critique. So talk a little bit about, what is that? Is it an appropriation? Is it just a source? You mentioned at one point, Theaster, that, it's a nod to fill in, to keep W.E.B, Du Bois present in these forums. So I'm just curious about what that current is, who these are, are they authorities, are they references, and how they collapse history and temporalities. It's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, thanks. So there is a concreteness in this space, in this exhibition, a kind of absolutism, right? And I think that I did that as a reaction to contemporary art. When I was talking, right before you came, I was making this point about a certain kind of exposure and how some artists might be unwilling to be exposed. And one way of dodging exposure is by remaining in an ephemeral state in a certain kind of exhibition moment. So that it's like, it's everything. It's like, and it's like, but not too much. It's not too much. It's a scattered debris. It's a jumbled, it's a constant failure of everything that could fucking fail. And by doing that, you gain an effusiveness. Now I'm stepping into a kind of deep water. Because I think rather than it's not a critique of that work as much as it is my own reaction to the fact that I can't afford to be effusive. I have to use my words. I can't be, next question. I haven't been given the luxury. I had to go in strong. I got to say, Mr. Mayor, we're doing this $6 million project. In order for us to do that, we need the city to support us in this way. Well, what is it going to be? It's going to be this, this, and this. I can't be like, well, and even though my nature might be, well, we were thinking, right? it doesn't always work. It doesn't always win. And so there was something that was like, well, all right, well, what happens if you just say, here's absolutely what I'm thinking? It's not like none of the forms are accidental or incidental, which means I'm exposed. What is it? Is it a painting? Is it tar? Are you trying to create a new genre? Is it a vocabulary that are you trying to say something against painting? Are you involved in the language of black paintings? Because they're absolutely black paintings, but I'm exposed. Because like, what could I offer black paintings? But I could have just, took some black t-shirts and thrown them in a corner and just made a pile of black t-shirts. Call it untitled black t-shirts. Y'all know what I'm saying? No, I'm because I like black t-shirts in a pile, but I felt like I couldn't do that here for some reason. It's like, no, I'm actually really trying to fuck with roofing. I really am gonna lean into this one material for a long time. I'm gonna lean into it. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I'm gonna lean in, and I'm gonna take the hits as a way of demonstrating courage to take the hits, because I feel like I'm in conversation with artists in my hometown. Then Rothschild, it's not a ready-made. I met Miss Rothschild. It's a trinket from a relationship. So even though there's a thing that's signifying Southside, mama's milk, Miss Rothschild calls the black men who work for her boys. Oh, that's my boy. But when she says it and she's 68 and she's talking about a 55-year-old man, it sounds weird. And it sounds recursive, like a throwback. I complimented Miss Rothschild on her torn jeans. She's 68. She had on torn jeans and a puffy white coat in the middle of the winter. And I was like, damn, you looking good, Miss Rothschild. Two brothers were like, yo, man, you need to slow that up. It was amazing. She had soldiers. They were joking-ish. You know what I mean? But they were like, and they just rose up from way over there, from behind the bulletproof situation. It was like, yo, blood, Miss Roth, hey, Ma, you okay? And it was 10 in the morning, and people were coming to get what they needed on a Sunday morning. So the reason that Rothschild is near the Madonna was because I was going to church and people were already going to the liquor store Sunday morning. That's the truth of, that's a spatial truth. That there were two lords. Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church in the corner store. And they were both offering the same thing. Affordable salvation. Because neither was free. It was affordable salvation. Affordable, a temporary wipe. A kind of, a community. These brothers, at 10 o'clock, they knew each other. It was like they were going for coffee. It's just so deep. So I think you're right. All of these things are trying to touch the truth of the history of art as I understand it. Is Nate in the room? Where Nate at? My guy Nate Young.
Yeah, Nate, yeah.
Nate could probably go past this Perrier bottle and be like, oh yeah, 1974. There's that green. That green reminds me of that Asher piece, 1970. He's like, he has both sides of the codes, Yeah. So I think the part that's fun for me is to say, okay, I don't know art history that well, but I've looked at a lot of images. And I know that these paintings are in conversation with something called art, right? I know that. I know that the Madonna is in a conversation, and because they're in this building, there's some conversation about art, right? But the affect part is that there are some things that I no longer have to care about with regard to who determines why my affect matters or not. I want to wrestle with who the affect is for, even though others might benefit. Like, I built the arts bank for black people on the South Side, period. Today when I was talking to these journalists, I was like, okay, I built it for this neighborhood, then I built it for black people, then I built it for art people, then the world can come. And that's what it is. It's like this, and then this, and then this, and then that. And that I feel good about that. You know what I mean? Like the Art Institute was built for this, and then this, and then this, and then this. All the institutions they may not say it. You know what I'm saying? But there are some primary audiences, and they don't really care what my opinion is about a Richard Tuttle exhibition. They're gonna have a Richard Tuttle exhibition, whether the extended people care about it or not. Richard Tuttle's gonna happen. And so then it's like, oh, well, everybody got that. You know, that. Okay.
It's so interesting to think about that in terms of the suffix that keeps popping up in the ish, you know, it's ish. Yeah. And as I'm hearing you talk and thinking about the work, codes happening, known codes, I feel one of the things the show itself is kind of doing is putting us in that zone of maybe we know, maybe we don't know. And in a way, it's a way of, and this is a comment more than a question, but a testing, not testing, but feeling out your audience a little bit. And that some people might know, be familiar with the Rothschild sign, some people may be familiar with the art historical references in the painting. And yeah, it's I don't mean to say that you're critiquing exactly, but there's definitely that work happening in a way that I remember speaking to Hans Hacke about the very famous Shapotsky et al. And it's always written about as if like, oh, he was out to get those landlords. And he was like, no, it just so happened to be that they were, you know.
He didn't know what he was going to find, you know, or who the characters were going to be. I mean, maybe there, you know, like I imagine that everybody in this room, like we all have some stakes in art or in life, or, you know, in art life and stuff. And I think one of the challenges of an exhibition, for me, one of my challenges, what I feel challenged by is that there's so many different ways to say something. So I could choose to say something really literally, like the Johnson, the bound ebonies, and I can say something very, I can use words, and I can put it in a form that's like, right. And that if I were to try to summate what was happening at Johnson Publishing, if people were already using the term Black modernism for what was happening at Johnson, that book work might represent that. And so sometimes those moves are really awesome to like, let's say, in that case, I'm in a moment of commemoration and honoring a corporate titan, because I feel like John Johnson did and Eunice Johnson did in their work artful things. Like their corporation was putting the power of the black image in front of black people for themselves, and then in front of the rest of the world so that the rest of the world wouldn't be afraid, so that they would know stories of black success that were equal to their stories and would humanize people that had been made demon. 1941, 1945, 41 Negro Digest, 45 Ebony, 51 Jet. That's amazing, right? And that I'm so invested in that the $13.5 million that the starting bid would cost to take the thing out of bankruptcy, if I could find $13.5 million, I would grab that motherfucker. I would grab it and I would change my title from artist to president and CEO of Johnson Publishing Company. I would give up my name. So that the stakes are not art stakes. Sometimes at all. They have nothing, sometimes the stakes have nothing to do at all with art. At all. At all, except the fact that they move through a place like this. At all, but the thing on my mind at all is not whether or not the thing sells. It's, can Johnson Publishing survive? I can't think about anything else except Oakley's death and Johnson. And the other things don't matter, and the stakes that matter. It's not about some fucking minimalism. Those are the forms through which we're trying to say things. And with companies go bankrupt all the time. But it's still hard to get past the fact that Columbia College bought that building and said that they would raise the money to make the penthouse a tribute to John Johnson, and they did not do it. And then they sold the building, and that is not right. And it'll become fucking micro apartments. And that is not right. And that is in that fucking grid of privacy. And it is not right. And if the things that are in my mind have to code so that I don't have to fucking cry in front of these people, they should fucking buy the college back. They should buy that building back and give it back to Linda. They should give it back to her. The fucking building needs to be a museum. It needs to be an active publishing company. But the legacy move didn't know how to make the pivot. It didn't follow the existing codes. Printing switched. It's not about a fucking found sign. A Jewish family was making alcohol pre-prohibition. The Benfields family and the Rothschilds. Benfields became Bennies. They were serving Italians, Germans, who were working on the South Side making buildings for Jews. Rothschild stayed in the 80s. They stayed. Their survival was in fact enhanced because some people didn't want to fuck with that shit. They just drink. And there was a lot worth drinking over. From the 20s till the 80s, there was a lot to drink about. And they stayed. Their relationships with those black men is tighter than my relationship with those black men will ever be, because I'll never want to know them. They're not good enough. I'll say, yo, what up, dog? They'll ask me for $1. I may have $1. I might give it to them. Miss Rothschild has a relationship with blackness. She is Day Mama. She is the Madonna. That's complicated. Those are the things that are on my mind. You know, but there are so many ways to say it.
There are so many ways to say it, but you are following an ethic. You are thinking very carefully about the ethical way of presenting these ideas, and there's a clarity. When you were standing up, Theaster, and you were talking about the priority of who you make art for, that is very clear, and that is ethical and responsible. And you know, we are in an art gallery, and you know contemporary art, and it can be as literal and didactic and flat as it can be, or it can be as ambiguous and unable to kind of tangle anything. You are just stuck in a mess, right? And you avoid both of those paths, even though they're very viable paths, as you know, within contemporary art, and you keep using and building, so there is a clarity on which you can lay on the politics, the meaning, the truths that you're talking about, so they do not get lost. They do not get lost and consumed in a didactic relationship with work, and they do not get lost in the ambiguity of the world that we're living in, quite honestly. There is a clarity in which you create so you can, so the things that you are passionate about cannot get lost.
Yeah, Michelle, but so let's say that at the same time that we're having this talk, the gazebo is being erected.
Yep.
The cost of the gazebo, the landscaping cost, the work to resurrect the gazebo, none of those things need to or should be articulated. There won't be an exhibition opening. The gazebo could never live here for me. I don't know why. Let's say, I don't know why I know that that's wrong. I don't know why I know that's wrong. But for me, the gazebo will never be in a museum space. The gazebo needs to be in black space where police kill black people. And people need, if Cleveland wasn't ready to allow people to mourn, people need the site. They need a reminder. They need a reminder that a thing happened here, right? Let's say. So the gazebo gets raised. With 1 or 2 Instagram posts. Because we're all trying to figure out, well, how do we honor Samaria? Well, we know that there's the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial. There are people that live their lives daily, passionately, fighting against systems of oppression and imprisonment. And those people are wondering, how is Theaster representing the violence of black male incarceration and the violence from police brutality? How did he get chosen to carry the torch for Tamir? And we're over here in prisons every day. And the answer is simple. My team had ratchets. We got the call and we took our tools and we unbuilt the thing. And then we tucked it away. And so, in a way, there are these multiple modalities that have to exist at the same time. And some will never enter the gallery. And that has to be okay. And even if it means that all of my money and 90% of my time is spent doing things that'll never bear consequential art history fruit, that the 10% of my time that makes 90% of the wealth that allows me to put that shit back on the South Side, this moment is important for something. But it's reasonable that the same fabricator that could make this grid is the same fabricator that could help me install Tamir Rice. And even he is scratching his head like, it's steel, but the modes are totally different. And the reasons for it, in the moment when everything conflates, I would have a problem with myself. So it doesn't feel like I'm doing something. I'm not trying to do something right. I'm following my intuition. And hopefully my intuition is loaded with enough of a sense of why that I would know, don't bastardize Black trauma. You know. Y'all know what I'm saying? It's when people walk up to me, y'all, people I know or don't know, they say stupid things sometimes. Like, well, it's obvious that you're doing well. Well, yeah, well, you've had a great year. And I get where that comes from, right? Because this machine is constantly telling people things. But those moves don't happen in a vacuum. Like, you know, like I said, they're not all successful. But it's been amazing to suffer a practice that is, I can't sleep. I can't sleep. I don't want to, I mean, you know, I have to sleep more. I know, Sharon, I have to sleep more. I know.
One more question, and it has to do with the Tamir Rice gazebo coming to Chicago from Cleveland, and it has to do with place and spaces, right? So, you know, we're in a no place right now. How artwork circulates, where it circulates, right? How we understand it as an economy, how we understand its transactions. And, you know, I was just thinking how you navigate very expertly the idea of the local, the hyperlocal, and also the global. But I think I've been thinking a lot about, doing a lot of work in Cleveland over the last couple years, thinking a lot about the gazebo, and thinking about regionality, and how regionality, you know, yes, we're fetishizing it right now within cultural discourses, but I'm just wondering, my question to you, and maybe even to Zach as well, is can regionality, that idea, the vernacular of a bigger place, bigger than the metropolis, right? And a place that includes, you know, the city and the suburbs and the idea of a rural space. Can we still talk about issues of race, of social justice within the framework of regionality? Like, I'm curious about that, and I'm thinking you're starting to bridge that with thinking about the American interior, thinking about Cleveland and Chicago, thinking about police violence, you know, all of that. And I'm just, you know, I don't know if it's answerable, but you're having me think about it, and I can't stop thinking about it, quite honestly. Like, what can be held in that place?
This makes me think about two things. One is it makes me think about Bryan Stevenson and his lynching memorial in Montgomery. And in a way, how that work is about counties, it's about a region, an area, and then it's also about the truth of a time. Then it's also about the truth that from the memorial, we remember that others were also massacred, right? That it's doing all of this different kind of work. And I remember thinking when I was first in touch with Samaria, there's no way that the gazebo makes sense anywhere but Cleveland. So maybe we should just buy an empty lot in Cleveland, and then it's on private property, and we should have some friends of the gazebo, friends of Tamir Rice, and we maintain the thing in Cleveland. And the city can't stop you from buying a piece of property and putting an ancillary structure on it. That's when the policy part gets interesting, or the understanding of land use law, or the codes of the city gets interesting. But then if you flip that and you take, Like, I don't know if white people in Cincinnati think about white people in Wisconsin and feel connected. But when a black person from Cincinnati goes to Wisconsin, they want to know where the other black people is. And that thing is really particular. It's the gift of blackness, right? It's the gift of blackness. And so then it's like, well, then maybe there's a way that if we put space aside, could we just accept that we're dealing with this kind of complicated truth that slavery never ended, and that the violence that was born of some sense of power that a person felt entitled to by massacring indigenous people and gaining security and a foothold in this land, that is it possible that that strand of total power still exists, and that people suffer still as a result of it? Now, I'm not talking, oh, all white people are racist. I don't really care about all that stuff. I'm just saying that sometimes the lack of understanding between a grown police officer and a 12-year-old, and the lack of relationship and the lack of friendship and the chasm between those two people are like the cage, is like the wall. And as long as there's no relationality of any sort, then you'll assume that the person that looks different from you is your enemy, and that you'll assume all of the loaded, predetermined things about the 12-year-old. You'll assume the worst. And so I also don't think that the gazebo belongs at the African American Museum. Right? I don't think that I don't think it should be paraded around the country. And it's like, oh, we could go see Tamir. Oh, over, you know what I'm saying? That I did a friend a favor, and then if it goes anywhere else besides the bank, it goes back home. Or it gets packed up and it gets buried. At some point, and then that's where other kinds of decisions have to be made, that include Samaria, her lawyer, her family. Like, is there ever a moment where we bury that? I thought this was gonna be an easy one, y'all. I thought this was light. We gonna go have some drinks after, kick it with my homies.
But we've talked a lot about a lot of things. But we started off talking about formalism. Word keeps coming to mind as something more along the lines of like sacred art, right? About which it's often, the most appropriate language for it is a kind of language of silence and reverence. And though you're working in 2019 in a commercial gallery, there is a kind of quality of the sacred or religious. And I wonder, if you, when you say it's not art, which I understand what you're saying, but maybe maybe it's art that kind of matters, like it's about what maybe art should be about in a way. And that would make me think that it's something closer to like sacred art. Yeah.
It's tough, Zach, because like when I think about Hito's work or Pierre Huyg's work or, people who also have, there's a motivation behind the work. I'm always talking about Ilya Kabakov. There's obviously, I believe in these makers, and they're no less causal than Kerry James. They're no less causal, but maybe the look of the cause is so different, or So with what I love about Ilya Kabakov is that what seems like material indifference was the truth of Russia. Ordering indifference was the truth of Russian bureaucracy, and that there's something super captivating about that, But I knew that I wanted to use these walls, and this middle one is just, I don't know, maybe it's 14 inches higher than these two. And it's just kind of like, no, I think we could work. I think this wall could work harder. The wall is already doing something. I think I can make it work harder. And so if there is a kind of a known and understood architectural code of God, that 12 inches could be the determining factor that takes this from hanging 3 paintings to making the space feel sacred. Those moves are exciting for me, whether I ever talk about them or not. And when I'm making those decisions, I'm not saying to myself, ooh, 14 inches to the top would make this really sacred. It's just like, I think that middle piece needs to be higher. And I don't have to ask myself whether that's a right move or not. I know that the piece needs to be about 12 to 14 inches higher. And that intuitive sense is different from, I don't make every pot. I can't make these tar paintings by myself. But there's still parts that nobody can do for me, and that nobody could do but me, And so,
Is that part where the voice in your head comes in?
yeah. And folk are kind of like, well, Theaster brought over a bunch of shit. A stone, a rock, a mask, and a pole. And that's the South Side. It's a rock, a mask, and a pole, and it don't look like shit. And that in fact the power of the pole, the rock, and the mask always there, but it has something to do with with aligning things, lining things, realigning things, squares, or you know what I mean, and that the ordering of things. All I'm doing on the South Side is ordering things. I ain't done. There's nothing magical. There is nothing magical. It is just the ordering of things that already exist. That's it. But it's not a ready-made. It's not a ready-made. It's something more special than that word.
Oh, yeah.
Just want to, we maybe have just time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if you're willing to take them. And thank you for such a fruitful and rich discussion. Do we have just a question or 2 from audience members?
It's really not a question. It's to say thank you. You touched me very emotionally on a lot of topics, what you're saying, and I was having that conversation earlier with my father about the Johnson's Publishing Company. And it made me so angry to see that legacy slipping away into other people's hands that don't care much about it. And I want to say thank you for keeping that DNA alive through your art and letting the spirits and the ancestors use you, creativity to show us, but for the young generation to understand what you're putting out to the world to continue to live. So I just want to say thank you.
You calling me old?
No.
Thank you, brother. It's very kind. Thanks, man. Thanks, sir.
I just want to say thank you, Theaster, for this wonderful exhibition. As an actor and filmmaker, I'm always drawn towards story. And so as I walked around earlier, I noticed the green books on the back side there, the volumes going all the way up. I don't remember what number it goes to, but could you speak a little bit about the story that those bindings are telling from beginning to end?
Yeah, so I guess we didn't talk much about the work. Sorry. So let's say that how many people think somewhere in their family's crib they have a loose ebony magazine? Okay. A loose ebony magazine doesn't matter much, let's say. A collective of bound ebonies matter differently because somebody spent the time to organize a set of volumes from this date to that date. In a way, the manifestation of the archive starts to show that someone cared or that power decided the thing was, power or money decided the thing was worth binding. Power, money, love, or care. So I thought, when I first started doing these binding works, could I bring ebony to the attention of others? Could I reimagine the absolute desire that people might have to consume a 1973 ebony magazine that's available in abundance as a single periodical? Could I increase their desire to read the thing if I played with its form? So that I aggregated Johnson ebony magazines, gave them a form that was familiar to eyes in a different way, and then I would allow the information from those magazines to inform a poem, so that whether a person opened the book or not, they could still get information. Pleasure, they could get pleasure, laughter, they could get some inside jokes about hog maws or something, right? And so that the inner content was blackness, the outer content was color field painting or modernism. And that those moments where the choice to bind brings, I don't mean dignity, I mean dignity, I don't mean dignity. But it makes the magazines do something else. The binding preserves the magazine. I'm playing with archiving as a form, but I'm also trying to redeploy jet magazines, ebony magazines, into people's cribs the way John Johnson did it. So it's like, oh, well, as soon as I buy Johnson Publishing next month, $13 million. If anybody wants to help be a part of the team. But when I buy it, I'm gonna then acquire all of the Johnson Publishing periodicals that I can find in the world, rebind them, and then redeploy them. And that's gonna pay me my money back, I hope, or pay them their money back. Right, because that's that other part, that cultural production, it actually costs money. And so I think that the piece is that it's a now and later. You know, it's like penny candy. You know, it's, yeah, did somebody buy that? I need somebody to buy that so that I come to the table so that I could buy this thing. And that's the other truth. That's the other truth of this situation, is that I don't need rent money. I need $13.5 million. And that some of us need rent money. That's where we at. Some of us need to find the $13.5 million to buy the fucking company back. And that's just scaled blackness. You know.
Loud enough. I wonder, why did you call it every circle needs a square?
The question is, why the title? Every circle needs a square. So I was having a show in Chicago, and it seemed like unnecessarily important. Like I hadn't had a show here for a while, and it seemed like there were all these stakes. And so I tend to start shows with a title, and I couldn't really find anything catchy that was like meaningful. So every circle needs a square was kind of like a way of aggregating forms that would allow me to be more, instead of trying to make some kind of succinct show of like one thing, like 12 paintings. The title gave me permission to be promiscuous in the studio and kind of see what was around that fit the criteria of the title. Right? Yeah. Once I was in the title, though, you can give it to her. Give me a second. Once I was in the title, then if we were to think about squares as some kind of intentional rationality or some kind of logical order, Chicago is a complicated city for me. So it was a way of talking about the truth that there are all these things that I want to do that feel circuitous or feel nonlinear or feel roundabout. But then there are all these policies that are pushing up against what I want to do, or all these rules or all these laws, or like my nephew want to smoke a joint, it's a circle. For smoking a joint, he goes to jail, it's a square. And then that shit gets really real really fast. So I thought maybe I could just have a really simple title and allow the title to be part of the code work and not let go of the code. It's just like, you know what? There's no meaning, it's just circles and squares. And then y'all figure it out. Something like that. But you roll a joint, you go to jail. But that don't happen in Colorado. So it feels like a kind of Chicago story. You know what I'm saying? Hey, I'm trying to get one of them round certificate stamps on a piece of paper so that I could grow some weed in Wisconsin. I don't know, whatever. Y'all know what I'm saying. Yes.
So related to that, I was wondering about the Agnes Martin painting, which seemed to be a starting point for you, and the squareness and the gridness and the nails, and which came first? Was it the title or the Agnes Martin, or does it all work together in your head, and once you start getting inspired, it's a stream of consciousness from one thing to the next?
Well, maybe even in the Agnes piece, I think that it's super dope that a queer white woman could inform me. And that my sculptural roots rest on one white woman. You know, like my somebody who graded me, who graded whether or not my bowl was right, you know. And there's like this understory of circles, like Ingrid teaching me how to make pots, and then Agnes, in a way, giving me permission to have both a romantic relationship with time and with silence and being selfish, giving me permission to have a studio practice. At times it could be rigid. And then from reading this biography feeling like there is nothing that I have in common with Agnes Martin as a maker. It don't shake out the same. It doesn't shake out the same, but nonetheless, Agnes Martin is always on my mind, or her philosophical thought is always on my mind. Some of her ways of living in the world are ways that I aspire to live in the world, you know. So I also just like that, you know, like I like how complicated learning is, and that sometimes when you learn a thing and you ingest it, it's not always evident in the output, but it's there nonetheless. So I thought it was a good way to kind of give Agnes a shout, because she's not evident. She might be evident in that floor work, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. Yeah, go get it, Zach. Don't be afraid.
Maybe Carrie's practice and what it means to try to give back to the community and why you choose to do that when there's sort of this like clap back sort of thing, and thinking about that within the form of the title of the show, like square and circle, soft and hard. What does it mean? Why do you choose to have this practice that is, yes, material, but also so much about being vulnerable and giving back to your community when you don't necessarily have to do that?
Yeah, y'all, you just gonna go to it. What's your name? How you know? What's your name? Kelly. Hey, Kelly. I mean, in some ways, y'all, let's say like, it's so sweet to have a moment like this when all your homies come out and I get to talk to all my homies. And let's say the byproduct of creating an environment like this is that 3 people might leave this room and be like, man, that was some bullshit. And so it's kind of like, well, do you choose to invite your homies out? Or do you choose not to have the convening because you don't want to deal with the fact that some people might talk shit? And I think that there's a thing in people who are kind of socially risk averse, who are kind of like, I'll choose not to be exposed. I'll choose to make moves so that I'm never exposed, right? In an artistic practice, one could choose to never mess up, you know, never get it wrong, or never be exposed. Or like socially, you know, some people never invite people over to their crib and they never say wrong things, and so they're never exposed. But I think that's not my way. You know, come on up, Michelle. Y'all, this is Michelle. We didn't start, Michelle. We're just, hey, yeah. I'm in the middle of this question, though. So let me try it again. Because it's actually kind of a super fundamental thing, like the installation of the Tamir Rice gazebo. Not everybody know how I got the gazebo. I always say to my studio team, there was a rumor in the streets that was like, oh, that motherfucker gonna paint it gold and sell it at Gagosian, and he's gonna monetize trauma. And there was this anxiety, or the place where I was exposed was that there was this anxiety that theaster can monetize anything, right? Then there was this idea that one might be base, I might be base enough to imagine that this site of trauma, that I wouldn't do right things with it. The assumption would be that you won't do right things with it. You know, and so then all you have is time. Or you only have what you choose to do with it. And so those moves which are not art moves. They're deeply human moves. Like and I can't even say that it's ethical or impulsive. I don't know what it is, but I know that there are certain things that we could do with that gazebo, and there's other things we can't do. Excuse me. And so, and I'm not, say, artist agency, I'm not necessarily asking anyone, what are your thoughts on how I should deal with Tamir Rice's death and the object associated with his death? Ain't nobody to ask. It's my move to get right or not, right? But what I know was that when Samaria called, she just needed some help moving the gazebo. If it creates a moment of public exposure, it's worth the hit. Hamza told me a story. He was on a plane with Okwe. So Okwe and Hamza on a plane. Holy cow. Awesome. They're talking smack. And then Okwe says, well, if you're not a heavyweight, don't get in the ring. If you're not trained up, if you were a welterweight and you want to hit above your class, you better do some more sit-ups. You better figure it out. And I think that there are moments when one has to just figure out, what weight division are you in? What class are you in? Whether that's ambition or intent or calling or purpose, you got to figure out what your square is. And then if you in that square, you got to occupy the square, and things like a public debate, that's just all part of being in the square or being in the circle or stepping out of the square, you know? And I think that Chicago, in essence, it could be a city that it can pack a lot of hits, you know? And so it means that if you know that there's a bunch of hits coming, you got to train. And sometimes you lose. Sometimes you don't. Thank y'all for coming so much. That was amazing. We cried together. We smiled together. You guys thank Zachary and Michelle for dealing with me.